Hi to anybody watching. Welcome to this meeting of the Borough Plan Advisory Committee. We have two main agenda items today. The first of which will be the proposed consultation on the Plan Wimbledon Neighbourhood Area Forum. And we've got some guests giving a presentation on that. That'll be followed by a look at the initial summary of public consultation on Merton's local plan. I'll kick off with apologies for absence. I don't think there are any, although we are at the moment waiting on Councillor Stanford, I think, to call in. And then we're going to do also, and it may be worth waiting a few seconds just to see if Councillor Stanford does call in for the declarations part, but I think maybe we should just move on with that. So the second part is declarations of pecuniary interest. If anybody has those, please do declare them. We also discussed before the meeting with some councillors, if you're a member of Plan Wimbledon or have been recently, if you could declare that as well, that would be useful to be able to refer back to. I see that people are declaring with their hands up, so if everyone can put their hands up now, that'd be great. Yeah, thank you.
Chair, I'm not on the list at the moment, but I'm hoping to be soon, so I'm declaring my interest now.
Okie doke.
Sorry, since you faded away there for me. Can you say again?
Okay. I was just going to. Well, I think we've done the declarations of.
Yeah, I've done no declaration. No.
Brilliant. Yeah, and apologies for that. Just so everybody knows, until my daughter goes to bed tonight, I'm stuck in the bedroom, so I may go in and out a little bit. But as soon as she has, I will move, and hopefully that won't be a problem anymore. So yeah, well, it looks like yeah, Councillor Stanford hasn't managed to call in just yet, but I think we should keep the pace of the meeting going. So I think the first part of this is we're going to have a presentation from our guests from Plan Wimbledon to kick things off, if you're ready to do that.
I'm happy to share the screen for the presentation for Suzanne to walk us through.
Thank you, Augustin.
Can you see it well?
Yeah. Okay. I have an issue. Sorry, is it possible whether you could stop sharing at the moment? Okay. Sorry, I might. Hopefully, I have the right one. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. Sorry, I don't know whether I will just start if I may.
Suzanne, I can share the presentation on screen.
Yes, okay, please. Okay, so sorry, thank you for giving us this opportunity to speak to you this evening. So my name is Suzanne Grocott, and I'm the chair of Plan Wimbledon. So I'm here with steering committee members Deborah Crosby, Augustin Bataille and Lynn Gordon. And we're going to take you through a brief presentation, which will take about 10 minutes, and we'll then be able to answer any questions you may have. So for our agenda on slide 2, we're going to talk about 3 main areas. What is neighbourhood planning? what are the benefits of neighbourhood planning to local authorities, and lastly, we can tell you about who Plan Wimbledon is. So neighbourhood planning was introduced as part of the Localism Act in 2011. The definition of neighbourhood planning, shown on slide 3, is taken from the gov.uk guidance notes on neighbourhood planning and explains the community benefits of developing a neighbourhood plan. The important words to emphasise are that the vision should be positive, that it meets an identified local need, and that it makes sense to local people. So the right to create a neighbourhood forum has been taken up by communities in their thousands. And whilst a neighbourhood forum can spend many years bringing a neighbourhood plan to referendum, over 1,000 neighbourhood plans have been adopted since the introduction of the legislation. But there are also benefits for local authorities in designating a neighbourhood area and forum, and working with the forum to develop a neighbourhood plan. So that the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government commissioned the University of Reading to undertake a report on the impacts of neighbourhood planning in England. And their final report was submitted in May 2020. So on slide 4, we've summarised their findings into 3 main areas. Better community relations. Because a neighbourhood forum is a non-political, community-led project, it has been found that more people are willing to get involved than if it is merely seen as just another council consultation. Ideas can be formed at a bottom-up level rather than being perceived as top-down, pre-agreed conclusions. Secondly, better understanding of local needs. In order for communities to benefit from a neighbourhood plan, the forum needs to undertake extensive consultation with the whole community to identify what businesses, workers and residents want from their area. And finally, more efficient planning. The design of planning policies and design codes can complement the local plan and ultimately lead to fewer contentious planning applications and greater efficiencies which can benefit the planning application process. So I'm now going to hand over to Deborah Crosby, who will tell you about Plan Wimbledon, starting on slide 5.
Thank you, Suzanne. Right, well, the first thing to say is that Plan Wimbledon is a volunteer group. We started out a few years ago, but actually we only got going really earnestly just over a year ago. And our inaugural general meeting was only in January 2020, which of course was just before COVID hit. And it was kind of threatening to compromise our efforts. But we kept going throughout lockdown, and now we've got a growing, wide and growing membership, currently more than 270 members. Important to recognise that some of these are associations representing an entire group of people. So actually the 270 odd is an underestimate of our current level of support across the area. Our membership encompasses both residents and businesses, reflecting the character of Wimbledon, where, you know, as you'll be aware, so many shops and bars and offices have got residential space above them and surrounding them. And our commercial areas are closely interwoven with residential. Our membership draws from landowners, different faith groups, schools and education establishments, and is diverse in its nature. It's led by a steering group of 10 members, all new to neighbourhood planning. So we're very grateful to the assistance of ACOM, which is provided by locality to help organisations like us get going. If we could have slide 6, please. Our mission, well, our mission is very simple and straightforward. It's to shape a better, more sustainable Wimbledon to enhance the lives of future generations of residents, businesses, workers and visitors. As well as that, we've got 3 core values which underpin our mission, which you can see always running underneath our logo. Firstly, sustainability, which is about recognising the urgency of global climate change and the need to get to zero carbon emissions. Secondly, prosperity. We know that a flourishing place is a happier place, So as well as acknowledging that Wimbledon must do its bit for London, it's really important that, you know, we want to see Wimbledon grow because it's going to be a better place to live in. Community, working together in the spirit of cooperation and collaboration, bringing together the different factions and interest groups to find common ground and win-wins. Slide 7, please. So what is it we're trying to set out to do? What's our purpose? Well, in line with the purpose of all neighbourhood plans across the country, we want to improve the social and economic and environmental well-being of Wimbledon. And at the moment, of course, we can't be concrete about what that's going to look like, because first we have to do an awful lot of research, as Suzanne said, to find out what people want. So we'll be canvassing different viewpoints from across the community, encouraging people to have their say and gain a clear picture of people's priorities in Wimbledon. We can then take those priorities and crystallise them into a written neighbourhood plan. Such a plan will accord with the strategic planks of the local plan, of course, but it will complement it by going to a deeper level, adding nuance and detail drawn from local knowledge and understanding. Slide 8, please. So whilst we can't be specific about what is actually going to go into the plan at this early stage, we can give you a flavour of the spirit in which we'll be doing it. So firstly, please know that we're supportive of Wimbledon's growth and excited to see it prosper. As I've said, a flourishing community is a happy community. And in our support for that growth, we'll be seeking to ensure that developments are of the highest possible standard, as well as bringing sympathy with the local surroundings. We'll protect the heritage of Wimbledon by identifying the places and peoples which people hold dear and want to preserve for posterity. We'll ensure that all parts of the community, businesses and residences, will actually feel the benefits from the work that we do. And of course, sustainability is going to be considered at every juncture and is really going to be at the heart of our ideas and our policies. Lastly, and not least, we want to do this in the spirit of collaboration. And really the important bit to emphasise here is that we really think we've got a fantastic opportunity to bring people together under this common aim. So the local authority, the businesses, the residents and the associations, all who want to make Wimbledon a better place to live. I'll now hand over to Lynn, and she's going to give you a whistle-stop tour of the area, in which we can see on the next slide.
Thank you, Deborah. As I said, to round off, I'm just going to give you a whistle-stop tour of the planned area. If we look at the map of the area, you can see that the planned Wimbledon area is the one shaded in orange. And just to put it in context, the blue line denotes the parliamentary constituency and the red one, the London Borough of Merton boundaries. As you can see, it's a relatively large area encompassing Wimbledon Town, South Wimbledon, the village, Wimbledon Park, and parts of West Wimbledon and Merton Park. And it's quite a densely packed area where the businesses and residents live cheap by jowl. The red dots show the geographic density of our current membership across the whole area. And as of today, as Deborah said, we've got just over 270 registered members. I think it's important to note this has grown by 20% in the last 10 days alone. About 250 of these are individual residents or businesses, and the remainder are associations which have multiple members, including 7 residents associations and others such as the Wimbledon Society and the Wimbledon Village Business Association. In terms of when we started to define our area, we wanted to include everyone who's either economically or emotionally vested in the Wimbledon area. It's where you live, where you work, where you visit, where you shop, where you go to the dentist, where your kids go to school, etc. So an emotional involvement with it. And we began by drawing a circle, a mile radius, based on the old civic centre next door to the station. And then we went around the area and consulted with as many groups as possible, residential, faith, educational, etc., about the boundary, to see whether they felt they were part of Wimbledon, and if so, did they want to be part of Plan Wimbledon. We've had an overwhelmingly positive feedback from these meetings, particularly so for neighbourhood planning, where several groups such as Rains Park and the Lower Wandle Valley Trust are keen to create their own neighbourhood plans. So we've been able to discuss and agree where the boundaries will fall between the two of us. In our application, it includes a verbal walking tour around the boundary, explaining how it was agreed in detail. We feel that this is a coherent and consistent boundary, which will enable us to fully serve the communities within it. Thank you. And back to the chair and any questions.
Thank you, Lynn and Deborah. So I hope this brief presentation has provided you with a better understanding of who Plan Wimbledon is and what we're aiming to achieve. So, I mean, the application provides a much more detailed analysis of the proposed area on which we want to consult, how the boundary was defined and why we think this boundary is appropriate. So, I mean, thank you very much. And I guess, Carl or Tara, whether I hand back to you for the committee to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That was really interesting. If we could stop sharing the screen now, that would be really useful. Brilliant. Well, in terms of what next for the meeting, I wonder, before we jump into questions to you both, I wonder if Tara, if you'd be happy just to quickly talk through the sort of consultation process and what's sort of needed to come out of that, and then if we move, if members are happy, that might help sort of set the scene for what's coming next.
Thank you, Chair. So just briefly, as outlined in the report, the stage of the neighbourhood plan we're at is, or the stage of the neighbourhood forum area we're at, is really the very, very first stage. In order to create a neighbourhood forum and area, there needs to be a 6-week public consultation to ask people living, and people and businesses and organisations living in and around the area what they think of the proposal. This is key because there can only be one neighbourhood forum for one area for a 5-year period. So as Plan Wimbledon eloquently outlined there, if another group wanted to become a neighbourhood forum for part of that area, they wouldn't be able to do so for the next 5 years if it was agreed. So the consultation is pretty important, really, and it helps to constitute, if you like, in planning terms, that this group can be the forum for this area. Excuse me a moment. So what's proposed in the report is that the recommendations from the Borough Plan Advisory Committee are passed on to Cabinet, and officers are recommending that Cabinet resolve to have a 6-week public consultation in and around the area illustrated on the presentation map and in the report to ask people and organisations whether or not they support this. And that consultation would take place between 12th of April and 23rd of May. And then Borough Plan Advisory Committee and Cabinet in June would make a decision based partly on the results of that consultation, whether or not this forum of Plan Wimbledon could become the forum for that area for the next 5 years, and therefore create the neighbourhood plan.
Great, thank you, Tara. So we'll move to questions. Would anyone like to ask a question? Councillor Latif.
Carl, it's Geraldine's here. Sorry I'm late.
No,
can you hear me,
problem.
Carl? Thank you.
No problem. And do speak up if you want to ask a question as well. I've got Councillor Latif coming in first, and then Councillor Pearce.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. First of all, a very good presentation, and I'm very, very excited. Hopefully it's going to turn out to be very good. My question is this, that currently there are a lot of groups in the Wimbledon area, such as the Wimbledon Society, and also a lot of influential resident associations who get involved in planning, who get involved in lots of local issues. So developments, planning, and local issues. So my quick questions, very three minor questions, are firstly, are those societies or resident associations, societies members of Plan Wimbledon? Secondly, what will you do which is different to what they already do? You know, I know, for example, when it comes to planning, Wimbledon Society heavily get involved in a lot of planning applications. And thirdly, what would you do in a scenario if on a particular issue, your recommendation or your direction is different to what the resident associations want or what the Wimbledon Society wants?
I don't know whether, if you want, I'll start. Maybe Lynn then can probably say something about residents associations. I suppose the first thing to say is that, I mean, when you say ours, I mean, whilst we're a steering committee, Plan Wimbledon will be the forum, and the members of the forum are the people who are, you know, are going to be, you know, will have a decision on what will go into the plan. So I mean that's why it's so important for us to consult, you know, as many people and varied people that we can do. So, you know, I would say, so it's not the usual suspects. I mean, for example, we are setting up a conversation with Clarion Housing in order that we can try and talk to the residents and get them to help us to talk to the residents of Hyde Park, you know, who's, you know, I would imagine not people who would normally engage in planning applications, but, you know, their view is just as valid. Because they live there and they you know, they have an opinion of what needs to happen. So I mean that's, you know, the first one in terms of, I mean, who we are. In terms of, I mean, what would be different. I would say we want to be, it's being proactive. You know, I mean, yes, there are a lot of planning applications and a lot of people do respond to those planning applications, but it's all reactive, and that's why you get a lot of people coming in with comments on planning applications, because, you know, at the moment that's the only avenue that they have to get their views across. So yeah, I don't know whether Lynn, whether you want to say anything about residents associations and membership.
Well, we have a very wide membership at the moment, and hopefully it will get wider. And as I said, Wimbledon Society are already members. 7 residents associations are already members. I think you have to remember we will be a neighbourhood forum, which is a different kind of animal. And we will be, you know, sort of in terms of our neighbourhood plan, we will be laying down, which we would agreed across the all of the communities, residents and business, sort of planning guidelines. And hopefully we will have brought them together, we'll have argued them through, because, you know, they won't be, you know, there'll be quite a few differences to talk through, I would imagine. But we will be able to do that, and hopefully it will make planning applications a little bit easier, and actually take quite a lot of the argument out of that, because we will have much tighter guidelines that we're working to.
And you don't see any overlap between yourselves and the Wimbledon Forum?
The Wimbledon Forum?
Mm.
No, I wouldn't. Well, there will be I think there are overlaps with all the groups, but we're hopefully discussing, we're going around and discussing what we're trying to do with all of them, and hopefully bring them into the tent, and to utilise really all the talent there is within Wimbledon to move this forward and to get agreement on it?
I mean, the main point is that a neighbourhood plan, which has to be, I mean, only a neighbourhood forum or a designated neighbourhood forum can put together a neighbourhood plan. I mean, we'll have to go to, you know, it has the same rigours as the local plan. So it will have to go to independent examination, and it has to go to a referendum. And it then will be a statutory document. So I would say, I mean, that is the main difference between, you know, any group that's, you know, there at the moment and what we're proposing.
Thank you for clarifying on that point. So I've said I'd go to Councillor Pearce next. Councillor Fairclough after that, and I'll come in after that.
Yeah.
Councillor Pearce,
thank you, Chair. I mean, my question is very similar with the Jeeps. I've been involved over 23 years in a lot of these local sort of discussions with local residents wanting this, wanting that. And I mean, I'm not against this. I think it's a good way forward to get as many local people involved as possible. But some people do tend to get very parochial when they're doing things like this. And when you have quite a few committed people like yourselves who want to do the best for their area. But what happens if the majority of people come up with a totally different view to you? Are you going to just accept the majority? Are you going to try and discuss it and sort of try and make them change their mind, or they might change you? How are you going to deal with that?
I mean, I think the thing is, there isn't actually an us and them, or maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying, because we are them and they are us.
Yeah, I think there is, because I've been, as I say, I've been on the council 23 years and I've been involved in loads of these things in local residents. I've chaired loads of meetings where I've had residents shouting and abusing each other because one group want one thing, another group, not on this scale, but they've got an awful habit of turning around and saying, you don't know, you couldn't make the decisions, you don't live in my street. You get that all the time. So what I'm saying, when I say you, I mean the committee or whatever you're going to call yourselves have how can I put it, a way forward, let's put it that way, what you'd like to see or how you'd like to see this taken forward. And the majority of people get involved afterwards because of all the, you know, we need that. We need loads of people making these decisions. They don't agree with it.
I mean, whether Augustine, whether you wanted to make a point.
So there's a couple of elements there. First, as regards the committee itself, we come from different parts of town ourselves, and so we're trying to have, you know, a certain representation of the whole community, geographically, but also in terms of their interests. So that's why we have educational groups, arts groups, faith groups, and etc. As part of our membership. So the effort that we're making today to build up our membership, the consultation that we are hoping to have in the next couple of weeks, and then the referendum on the plan are all part of that consensus building across the entire community, so that the plan that arises from that is a plan that everyone adheres to. So it is not a situation where we are campaigning for something specific. It is something where the steering committee is trying to canvass a consensus around the community for the neighbourhood plan.
And also, I mean, just to say, so I mean, there is a governance structure behind the steering committee. So I mean, it's not as if, like, you know, once the forum is there that we're going to be there and it's us for, you know, for 5 years. I mean, every year the steering committee has to stand down and has to put itself up for election. So I mean, in this scenario where you suddenly did have a majority of views that don't feel that the steering committee is following or taking account of their views, then they can get voted out and a new steering committee can come in.
Okay, thank you for that. Did that answer enough of your question, Councillor Pearce? You're on mute at the moment.
Yes, thank you. I think I like that answer. Thank you.
Thanks. Councillor Fairclough.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the steering group members for the presentation. I wanted to add at the beginning of my question that I'm a big supporter of neighbourhood planning, and I've been involved to a greater or lesser extent in Plan Wimbledon. Certainly not in the last couple of years, but the years before that. I think it's worth certainly for some of my councillor colleagues possibly highlighting that the aim here is to set up a forum who essentially develop part of the local planning rules. It's not an interest group in the same way the Wimbledon Society is. It's a group that will come together to build a consensus around a document that will become part of the planning rules and thereby influence planning that way, rather than comment on planning applications. It will set the guidelines. My question, which I suspect is possibly one more for Tara, is around the process here. I know there are a number of technical requirements that an application for recognition as the neighbourhood forum needs to meet, and I wonder who and when assesses those are assessed. And with the consultation, I note it says it comes back to the Borough Plan Advisory Committee. What powers does this committee have at that point to pass the recommendation on? Does the committee itself have any powers to recommend changes to say the shape of the area that the forum would represent, or is it merely that we will be presented with a report with advice on whether to recommend on to the cabinet? What's the way this works?
Well, as Plan Wimbledon said, the whole approach really should be collaborative right the way through between us as a local authority and Plan Wimbledon as the proposed forum or any other forum group. Let's say we have a scenario that during the consultation, a group of residents or a group within the proposed area says, thanks, but no thanks. We want to do our own plan. We'd rather that you move the boundary this way or that way, so we are now out. As part of the consultation, we would feedback that back to Plan Wimbledon pretty swiftly. And as officers, we'd probably say, you should really consider this seriously, because as set out in the sort of guidance, what we shouldn't be doing is imposing an area or a forum on a section that really has said quite emphatically that they'd rather do something different. So we would ask Plan Wimbledon to reconsider their proposals in that regard, to maybe move the area boundary. And hopefully by the time we arrived at Borough Plan Panel, this issue would have been resolved. In the scenario where it becomes more of a conflict, yes, we might be coming to Borough Plan Panel saying, actually, we could only see as officers that we could recommend that this go ahead if the area was slightly different shape because of the consultation feedback or because of some of the information. I mean, I really hope we don't get to that point, and we've had a very collaborative relationship with Plan Wimbledon so far, but that is something we could present to the Borough Plan Panel and ask you as councillors to advise Cabinet onwards. It's worth saying that it looks like the final decision on this would rest with full council in July, as set out in the committee reports. It's such a kind of important issue that it's actually not an executive decision. It would be by vote of 60 councillors, because as we've described, this would be then the only forum for that area for 5 years. And also because the plan that they will produce will be something that, as you said, is a statutory document. It will be declared every time someone buys or sells a home in that area until that plan falls away. So it really has weight. It influences the information provided for property sales. It's a really important document. So it would be 60 councillors vote at full council that would make the decision on whether Plan Wimbledon could be the forum for that area. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks for that, Tara. Did that answer your question, Councillor Fairclough?
Yes, thank you. Yes.
Great. I've got a couple of questions actually.
Carl, it's Geraldine. I'd like to ask some questions, please.
I will let you go ahead. I will let you go ahead, Geraldine. And I will
Okay.
after you.
Thank you. Okay. Well, first of all, I'm very glad to hear that you're liaising with Clarion. I mean, as you probably know, they've got an awful lot of properties in Merton, all over Merton now, and so it's absolutely important that they are included in the housing estates that are included in the discussions with Clarion. Are taken, are considered because they've already had some quite difficult situations to deal with so far. So they need to be included in the discussions about what's going on in their neighbourhood. I'm a bit concerned about the dates. The consultation being between April and the end of May. We've got the mayoral elections coming up at the beginning of May. We're not quite sure how they're going to be carried out yet. With the guidance that's going on, and the work that'll have to be done to ensure that's done safely. And I just think that it might cause confusion when people are having to, work out how they're going to vote, or where they're going to vote, or if they're going to vote at all, be able to vote at all, and also get involved in this consultation at the same time. So I'd like a bit of clarification about that, and also I'd like to know if you've been liaising with the Chamber of Commerce, because obviously they I would think just about every business in Wimbledon is linked to the Chamber of Commerce, and so they obviously have a lot of information about what's how they'd like the area shaped. And picking up with what Dennis said about the dare I say clash of personalities in the past between Residents Group and Mitcham Society, not Mitcham Society, Wimbledon Society and other groups who have tended. I mean, I've been involved with Wimbledon and planning applications and stuff like that for 30 years nearly now. So I'm very well aware of how some of these residents groups and Wimbledon Society do tend to dominate the situation. So I'm really glad, I think it was Tara who said that they are trying to open it out to include people who are currently, all kind of members of the area, people in the area, rather than just those particular groups who in the past, as I say, have tended to have a clash of personalities and take over the show, if you like. So hopefully that will improve the situation, because I know a lot of people in the past who said, well, what's the point? This residents group or that resident group, know what they want, and they're never going to agree with what we want, kind of thing, in our residents group. So hopefully that will improve that situation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know whether I can
do you mind if I
actually talk to whether Augustin would like to say something about the work that he's been doing with businesses.
Yeah,
because it is very important that this isn't just residents.
Oh, certainly, and I'll bring you in a second. If before that, if Tara could just come in on the timetable for the consultation. I think it's the timetable is a legal thing, but just to answer that first question from Councillor Stanford, and then we'll come back to you both. And I'll use my chair's privilege just to add something to what Councillor Stanford has said. I think it is an interesting point, the point about the Chambers of Commerce. And it'd be interesting to know more generally, your engagement with them, Love Wimbledon, and what kind of the balance is between businesses that are involved as well as residents at this stage, obviously. But Tara, if you could just go ahead. to start with.
Thank you, Chair. This is relating to Councillor Stanford's question about the consultation. As you'll see in the reports, there are statutory timetables for councils to adhere to when doing this type of work. It's designed to make sure that councils make prompt decisions and don't sit on proposals for a very long time. What that means in practice is that we have 13 weeks from the first day of the consultation to making a decision on the forum area. And we have taken advice from our legal colleagues about consulting during the pre-election period for the mayor, but the advice at the moment is that mayoral candidates have not made significant statements about Plan Wimbledon, so we are allowed to continue doing the consultation at this time. I will say that it's likely to be given the circumstances of COVID-19, it's likely to be an online-only consultation from the council. And as with all council consultations, it will be fairly dry. It will simply say, do you support this or not, or do you have any other views? And we'll be taking comments through an online questionnaire and email and things like that. And we'll be diverting any comments about what Plan Wimbledon would like to do, or the neighbourhood plan that's proposed, to Plan Wimbledon to answer with people directly. So it is quite a process-heavy point. But just to recap, because there is a 13-week timetable, if you like, that's why the consultation is set out the way it is. If we are to move it, it will be slightly tricky legally. I think it would be possible in the scenario that we couldn't consult during the pre-election period, but it would be, we're advised to get on with it as soon as possible.
Okay. Thank you, Tara. Yeah, so sorry to interrupt you there, Suzanne. So I think you were suggesting that Augustine might be the best person to take the second part.
So thank you. As regards businesses, it's actually an area of focus since the very beginning for us. And you may have seen in our application that we have identified very accurately numerous zones of, let me say, business activities where we have offices, retail presence, and etc. And so we have prepared a very structured program of identification of all these businesses using online resources, but also walking down the streets and taking notes of all these businesses. And we've been reaching out to them as much as possible in person to establish that contact with them, that engagement, explain them what is Plan Wimbledon about, and have their views and invite them to join us, obviously. And we have also done the typical sort of presentations online, email outreaches, and etc. As we have, as we continue to engage with businesses, we do something very similar as to residents. We not only reach out to businesses individually, but we also go to business associations, business groups, and there different shapes and forms of them. You may have heard about Wimbledon Scene, which is very present on Facebook, and advertises various businesses locally. They are supportive of us. They've been sort of sharing some of our publications on social media, for example. We have one business association that is formerly member of Plan Wimbledon, and there was a specific question about the Chamber of Commerce. We have a very positive dialogue with the Chamber of Commerce, and if you go on their website, you will see that I have shared one of our publications as well. So while some businesses may not be formally members with us, we have a very positive engagement with the community, and we see also the number of businesses joining us as members increasing.
Thank you for that. Does that answer your questions, Councillor Stanford?
Yes. Yes, I think I believe so. Yes. Well, yes.
Brilliant. I think Councillor Butler has indicated he'd like to ask a question. Go ahead, Councillor Butler.
Thank you, Chair. And sorry, I dropped off earlier, so I do apologise if this might be covered, and tell me as soon as I ask the question if it is. Firstly, I did note, and thank you very much for the presentation, and I am excited to be involved in this in the future. Firstly, I did note that you mentioned that your membership has got a quite big increase very recently, especially. So my first question is, what are the key aspects of your, the key wins on your and successes in your engagement there? What has worked, and how are you going to push that forward to be a regular thing? that you can engage the community with. And I'm also noting that your age classification in your members, as with many things in local government, are weighted towards an older age. And it's especially worrying for me in that a lot of these planning decisions take years to come to fruition. And so it does worry me that you've got a relatively low percentage of membership in younger age groups, below 45. And these are neighbourhood plans are exactly the type of thing that will have impact for younger families going forwards in the next few decades and beyond. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that and how you aim to rectify that. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know whether, I'll say something, and I'm sure whether Augustin will want to come in and also say something. So, yes, we do recognise that. I think it's any consultation, it's always very difficult to get that younger age group involved. We are going, to schools, even primary schools as well as secondary schools, because you're right. They're the people who are going to be, inheriting the Wimbledon of the future. We have a plan that's looking out 15, 20 years. So we are, have spoken with a number of schools to work with them to get a community project, even just finding out, from the youngsters, what do they like, what don't they like. We have got the Wimbledon Art College, schools of English that we can also reach out to. But Augustin, whether you want to say something?
Sure, thank you. So yes, so the age thing, there's also loads of anecdotal evidence we have in our membership as we engage with people. For example, we know that some families are members through the parents, but that they've talked about Plan Wimbledon to their children and etc. The whole family would not necessarily sort of register, if you want, individually and things like that. And we know that through sort of the neighborly contacts that we have generated as part of the engagement. So that's one thing. The other thing is that we are sort of ramping up our social media presence, and we are expecting to be sort of more visible, to the younger population through Twitter, Instagram, and etc. So it's not something that happens sort of overnight, if you want, but that is something that we expect to sort of grow progressively, also with workshops, with schools. We already have, I know one school particularly in mind that has already indicated sort of support for potential workshops involving children. There was another question about the recent membership increase, which I can also happily address. There is no specific item that generates that increase. It's just that since the beginning of the year, we really have a big momentum of new members joining us. The engagement that we have with people actually takes time, right? Whether it's at individual level, contacting a business or an association. It takes time. We do online presentations with them. They reconvene internally and etc. So a surge like this, it is not just by luck. It's actually the reflection of the past few weeks and months of effort. In terms of the composition of these new members, we had additional faith groups, additional businesses, and additional residents and the residents associations joining us over that period. So it's a very varied increase in our membership.
Thank you for that. Has that answered all your questions, Councillor Butler?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm assuming that I'm just about the youngest person on this panel. I don't look it. I think local government has aged me quite well, but I'm in my 20s still, just about. But I do think that these long-term planning issues, it is vital to get young families involved, because as you have mentioned, these are the people that are going to be living it with it longer than anyone here. So thank you very much for the presentation there. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that. Are there any more final questions before we wrap up this particular item? Nope, doesn't look like it. Well, I guess it leaves it to me to say a big thank you to all of you, to all four of you, for coming and presenting and answering our questions tonight. And I think by the sounds of it, we'll look forward to seeing the results of the consultation in June. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So Tara, the next item of business is the consultation feedback on the local plan.
Chair, could I just ask if we could resolve a vote on whether or not to support the consultation at Cabinet?
Yes, and
as per the committee report for this
very
item.
well advised to the chair that had forgotten to do that. I apologise to the committee. If we could go for a vote to Cabinet as Tara has suggested, please. All in favour? Councillor Stanford?
Yes, I'm in favour, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Tara.
Okay, thank you all. So, are we okay? You're leaving now?
Yes, you're yes, you're welcome to leave. And,
all right, thank you. All right, good night all.
Good
Good
night.
night. Thank you.
So now to the next item of business, which is the summary of public consultation on Merton's local plan. Tara, are you happy to do a short introduction to this item?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'll briefly introduce the report. So last time we met, we were in the middle of the public consultation on Merton's local plan that took place from the 13th of November to early February. And in fact, we continued to accept responses right up until the end of February, partly because we recognise how difficult the current situation is with COVID and how disruptive it's been to people's lives, and how a few people contacted us and simply said, can we submit late? And we also had an IT issue with one of the documents, the sustainability appraisal, which was unfortunately password protected for the first few weeks of the consultation. So we received 254 responses, and I cannot thank the people and organisations who responded enough, because these were incredibly detailed, incredibly complex responses for the most part. You know, some of them ran into 40 pages. There's a lot to get through, and we're still reading through a lot of them and going back over them to make sure we've understood them. They're all available online. And the report really summarises the key main things. I'd like to draw councillors' attention to a few very big ticket items and a few quite detailed items for the next steps. I suppose the consensus, and this is probably the first time there's been an absolute consensus right across the responses we've received, is that climate change has come, front and centre in people's responses on the local plan. Now, it's always been fairly important, but I've never seen it that it really has dominated responses from absolutely every cohort, from business groups, from residents groups, from individuals. It is unusual. It is definitely a step change. And the request is mainly, make sure this is embedded better in the local plan, make sure that the local plan really represents what the council is doing on, climate matters, on the climate action plan. And I feel that this is something that we will definitely recommend taking forward to really make sure that the local plan prioritises climate change. You'll be aware from seeing the policies that actually Merton's local plan policies on climate change, the specific ones, are going much further than we have before, and we're going much further than many other London boroughs. And we're targeting all types of development. But there's spin-off benefits. There's benefits to tree planting, green cover, biodiversity, air quality, and all of those issues we talk about in the local plan, but maybe we haven't embedded in the climate change right the way through it like we should have. So that, I think, is a major strand coming out of people's responses. and it's a major recommendation for moving towards a final plan. The other quite straightforward and obvious item is COVID recovery. We wrote this last consultation draft of the local plan, probably majority of it last July, August. And it seems extraordinary that back then, although we were within the pandemic, it feels like we know so much more than we did then about how the pandemic is changing the way we work, what the future trends. You'll probably all have seen items in the paper about, is it going to change the way we live? Is it going to change the way we work and travel? It certainly has already changed the way we shop and consume things from society. And is this going to be a blip, or is it going to be, again, a step change? So it's fair to say that COVID recovery isn't embedded in the plan, and that will be something that we really will be looking at for the final plan. That will be quite difficult to predict, because I expect, as we're finalising the plan in June, unfortunately, as we know, we will still be hopefully coming out of the pandemic. But you'll have probably seen the wealth of information that's being published on this. And the Mayor of London and lots of businesses are advising on what the potential futures could be. So we will be looking at that really closely. There are a few other strands that we will be taking forward as well. We'll be making sure the plan is a good deal tidier and as professionally produced as we possibly can. But now I'd like to draw councillors' attention to, I suppose, 3 or 4 key points in the report that groups of people have felt very strongly about. The first one is about Collier's Wood, the policy on Collier's Wood, and particularly the site allocation beside the existing tower. You'll see from the report that there's a petition of 417 signatures, plus an awful lot of local plan consultation responses that have clearly said local plan should be amended to reflect the previous consultation draft, which had the existing Collier's Wood Tower as the pinnacle building in that area for height. So you may recall that at stage 2, that was a pinnacle. In the current policy, our existing local plan that's used for planning applications today, Collier's Wood existing tower is the pinnacle height. And we proposed in this consultation to change that. It's very clear that people's views are not supportive of that. So what we propose is to go back to what we have as the existing policy, to make that the pinnacle height. There's another comment as well, a series of very, very strong views about the proposal for exploring a secondary access at Willow Lane. And I'd like to thank the people who responded to this so strongly. This proposal really arose from the fact that we have a 48-hectare industrial estate, largely full of heavy industry, and we only have one main access along Goat Road that can deal with heavy vehicles. So in the very low chance that something might happen to that could be quite difficult for the area. We also, as we know, have Connect House with residents inside, which was converted to residential through prior approval. And it's a very low probability of something happening, but the impact could be very high. So successive local plans have sought to explore a secondary access. And all the local plan was proposing is that we explore this. We weren't proposing a particular road, and we weren't proposing a particular design, because any design would have to be designed to modern standards. But there's really strong views about this. So we propose now that we recommend that we remove the current proposal and we reinvestigate with the emergency services how we could make sure that in that unfortunate scenario that the emergency services vehicles will be able to access the estate if something was to happen at the Bourne main access. Just briefly, 2 more points. There were a number of inquiries about the future of Watley Avenue. This is the site that's currently being used for the children for Harris Wimbledon, and shortly Harris Wimbledon will have the main school site. And lots of people made inquiries as to the future of that site. Some people it was just inquiries, for others they were quite clear that they felt it should continue in educational use. The council's plan proposes that that it would only move to residential use if it wasn't needed for educational use. And councillors may be aware that at the recent Children and Young People's Overview and Scrutiny panel, there was a paper presented there that sort of set the direction, part of the paper set the direction of travel, that Whatley Avenue is likely to be needed for special needs education in the long-term future. So that being the case, we will likely to propose, we'll confirm that with our education colleagues, but we'll likely to propose removing it from the local plan if it's going to be used for education purposes, as it indeed it is now. This report also contains some information about the updates from the Mayor of London. On Tuesday of this week, the new London plan was finally published, which sets the strategic direction for London for the next 10 years. Having said that, the Secretary of State has required the Mayor, or the future Mayor, to review the London plan almost immediately on housing matters. So that will be taking place over the next few years. And the other statutory consultees, such as Historic England and Thames Water, gave some very detailed responses on site-specific matters, which really helps us plan for, in Thames Water's case particularly, it helps us plan for future infrastructure, which is extremely helpful. So, Chair, councillors, if I could take questions at this point.
That's great. Thank you, Tara, for that. That was really useful and really interesting in terms of setting the scene and highlighting some of the pieces of the report. Yeah, let's go to questions. I'll reserve my questions to the end. Councillor Butler, I've seen first, and I think then Councillor Fairclough.
I'd like to ask a question, please, Carl.
Okay, I'll come to you after.
Thank you. Yep.
Okay, great. As well. Councillor Butler.
Thank you, Chair. And yeah, thank you very much for the report there, Tara. My first question kind of links to my theme in the last item in terms of the types of residents we're engaging with. If we've got any details about that, I'm not sure if we have there. And maybe a couple of other points, just to comment that I'm very glad about the officers' support of reversing back to that original policy of the Colliers Wood Tower. I think what we've seen is very much a big engagement from residents, and to show we're listening there. So I'm really happy about that. And just to explore that in terms of the Willow Lane industrial estate, you might have just added all the detail you can there, but I was just interested in what types of alternatives can be given to that access if that is removed from the local plan, and how do those conversations often happen with emergency services? And then my third point, which kind of links to the Whatley Avenue issue there, which is that a Merton building being put on this plan for potential future use, but then a secondary issue of education needs in the future, having to take this off the local plan. Are there any other Merton buildings that could that might need to be removed from the local plan for similar issues in terms of longer need and use from Merton? I've quite a few questions there, sorry.
Thank you, Councillor. If it's okay with you, I'm going to take them in reverse order, and I might need a reminder as I lose my memory on the earlier ones. On Whatley Avenue, the last main use before Harris Academy was for adult education. So the site has been in education use for a number of years, I think at least a decade. The site in the local plan is allocated for residential only if it's not needed for education use. And that's the only site that we have in Merton Council's ownership that's in that case. Another example might be Wilson Hospital and Birches Close. So they are two NHS sites, and in the current adopted local plan and in this new one, they are one of those could be used for education only if it's not needed for healthcare. But that's not in the council ownership, but it's the same scenario. So those 3 sites are the ones I can think of where there is that slightly unique scenario. They're all in education or health use at the moment, and they could be used for other purposes if it's clarified that they're not needed for that particular use. In the case of Watley Avenue, it's been used for 3 years now for the Harris students, and pretty soon that they won't need that site anymore. So the question now is what the council would use it for in the future. And it's fair to say that for some time our education colleagues have been looking for special needs accommodation because of the increase in special needs educational provision that we need to provide in the borough. And they've clearly said now that this is what they propose for Watley Avenue. So it will continue as it has for the past decades in educational use. So to summarise, that's the only council site that is in that scenario, and the other 2 are NHS sites. On Willow Lane, yes, we will speak to the emergency services and see if we can assess the scenario where I think it's very unlikely, but the impact will be high if Goat Road was compromised. Now, there are other ways of getting into the site for smaller vehicles, and what we need to test for the emergency services is whether they could work in the case of an emergency for a larger vehicle, and how they would be able to move around Willow Lane. If any of you have visited Willow Lane recently, then you'll be aware that some roads are privately owned and closed off. So it's also a question of liaising with the site owners to make sure that emergency vehicles are only denied entry by fire gates and things like that. So what we would do is we would simply look with the emergency services and make sure a fire tender, an ambulance, would be able to get onto the site successfully in that scenario that Goat Road was compromised. You had another point about Collier's Wood, and yes, it's absolutely emphatic, the consultation feedback on the tower being the pinnacle height, and it is useful because this has been tested at consultation, so that way the council can be sure that the final plan of having the current tower as the pinnacle is definitely the correct direction of travel. Did you have?
And then if it's possible to have information, if it's there, about the demographics of the residents that gave information to the consultation, and how perhaps reflective or not that may be of the wider population of Merton.
Yes, we used an online survey to get feedback, and we also invited people to email us, because in our experience, individuals are very happy with using an online survey. It tends to be that associations and groups prefer to have a document because they tend to want to send it around their residents association or around their Thames Water or wherever. So in our experience, we get 2 types of responses every time. I can send councillors on the details we've got from the online survey, which specifically asked the questions about age and background and things like that. Not everybody answered them. And I think it's fair to say they're only representative of the individuals who answered the online survey. So there are probably another, I think 100 people or so answered the online survey, and there's probably another 200, or just shy of 200 representing groups that didn't. So I can send councillors those details.
Thank you. Councillor Fairclough.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Tara, for the report and setting it out for us. Unfortunately, a bit like Ben, I've got 3 questions, so please bear with me. One's more general and 2 are more specific. So with the more general question, you note, Tara, that you're still going through the sort of consultation responses again and in detail, and obviously the appendix is sort of fairly light touch in a sense. It's a real summary for us here tonight, and I wondered if at some stage if you are still going through them, and therefore there may still be further changes that you might look to make in response to the consultation responses or not, and whether we might get a sense of what further changes downstream you might make in response to the consultation. That's my sort of general question. My more specific question, again, one relating to Colliers Wood, I think everybody will be relieved about the response there, although I wonder about if you might outline for me the sort of technical definition of a pinnacle height. I mean, I wonder whether Britannia Point is a very, very high building. I don't know that the residents would necessarily want lots of other buildings of that height, but I don't know if that's maybe not the technical definition of a pinnacle height. And then lastly, building on Councillor Butler's point about education land, and also tied to Colliers Wood, the Colliers Wood Ward councillors note in their objection to the Colliers Wood Tower the impact on local schools, and obviously the London plan, in whatever form it will have very high housing targets, and it's at least a fair assumption to say that there'll be increased demand on school provision downstream, and yet nowhere in the local plan do we see any additional capacity. Now, I presume that's because education colleagues don't believe that additional capacity would be needed, but I just wanted to confirm that.
Thank you, Councillor. Again, I'm going to start working backwards. Yes, on the issue of school places, it is brought up by different groups and different individuals. I think it's fair to say that there's always an underlying concern that the council is planning for homes and forgetting about GP surgeries and school places and all the other things we need to do. So to accompany the local plan, there's an infrastructure delivery assessment, which goes through everything really, from water and wastewater to healthcare, school places, etc. All the things we need to enjoy where we live. And for school places, we liaise very closely with our education colleagues. They use the same demographic information that the Mayor uses to plan for new homes. And councillors will be aware that most, if not all, of Merton schools were expanded over the past 12 years. And the current projection, certainly for the medium term, is that we won't need new school places outside the special needs sector in Merton at present, because we have this extra capacity that was arisen from school expansions. Now, we keep an eye on that, and we work constantly with our education colleagues on those grounds, but this is also common to other London boroughs. So if one looks across London, and most boroughs have expanded their schools in some way or another, currently there is enough capacity in the education system, primary and secondary, in other boroughs as well. There is a sense of popular schools, so schools that are high performing will be in lots of demand. Boroughs with high performing schools, which include Merton, but also Sutton, often have more demand for their school places than boroughs with lower performing schools. But it's fair to say that we've done quite a lot of work on this, and at present there isn't an expansion need for school places outside the special needs sector. You made a point about, can you remind me, Councillor, what you made the point about?
Taking them in reverse, Britannia Point as the pinnacle and what the technical meaning of that is.
Thank you. I've written down Colliers Wood, and I couldn't quite remember the full question. Yes, the part of the work a local plan has to do is it has to identify places where tall buildings may be acceptable. And in Merton's current adopted local plan, those three places in Merton are Colliers Wood, Wimbledon and Morden. But it's fair to say that tall buildings mean a different thing in each place according to the prevailing design and the characteristics of that area. So for example, in Wimbledon, there are a number of taller buildings on the Broadway, but there are also some buildings that are only two or three stories high. So in Wimbledon, the local plan describes the scenario where instead of having a sort of broken teeth look along the Broadway, that the buildings that are 2 stories high may be allowed to grow to be near the height of the existing prevailing roofline. In Colliers Wood, describing Britannia Point, the existing tower as the pinnacle, really means that future buildings should be near that height, not at it, so it looks like a big slab of identical buildings, but near that height. And if Britannia's the pinnacle, they should really be slightly lower to give a sort of step down approach, which tends to look better in urban design terms rather than identically sited or heighted taller buildings. And there was one more.
Yes, it was a question about the consultation and whether you were making it, or whether you could see that there might be further changes to the local plan in response to the consultation, other than the ones set out in this report here today, or whether this is it. That's what I was trying to get to the bottom of.
I think what we're doing, just to describe, is we've read all the consultation responses, but what we're doing is we're going through them in lots of detail and picking out, frankly, every single point within them, and preparing an absolutely enormous list of each individual point and then a commentary as to the next steps. So in some cases, that commentary will be that we need to get back to the person who made it. In some cases, it reflects a general view across many representers, and we have a way forward. In some cases, it might, for example, clash with things we're statutorily obliged to do, such as build more homes. And we are preparing an absolutely enormous Excel spreadsheet of every single point within the comment. So not the entire comment, but even the individual points within them. And that I thought we'd be able to do this within a month, but the fact that there's 250 comments, just over, it doesn't reflect the extent people have gone to make their representations, and we need to do justice to that. So having read all the responses, I don't think we'll be coming back to councillors proposing a different direction of travel, but we will be looking at the individual points and saying, actually, these are some of the changes that need to be made on individual sites or individual policies.
Thank you for that, Tara. I'm going, with apologies to councillors Latif and Stanford, I'm going to use my chair's privilege and bump Councillor Pearce to the front and bring him in next. That's all right. Go ahead, Councillor Pearce.
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Good. When I came into the borough, I pretty quickly found Willow Lane, and I've used it for 35 years. I mean, I'm now in my 70s, so I don't use it that often. And you're talking about an extra entrance. Well, when I was using it, heavy vehicles bully smaller vehicles out of the way, so it clears pretty quickly. But looking from a grandfather's point of view, there is at least one building. Do we have any control at all over the safety of individual buildings? Because there was one there before the pandemic. I took my eldest granddaughter to gymnastics there, and it's about 3 or 4 floors, and they're all full on a Saturday at least, and there are 100, 150 youngsters in there. Now the rooms are very big, the halls are very big, but when you come down the metal staircases, if there's a fire, there would be chaos, because the entrances, the hallways and the entrances getting out are so small that all you need is 2 or 3 people abreast, and it would be a disaster. Do we have any control over that? And if we're going to put in an extra road for the emergency vehicles, could we take control of that issue now? Then?
The honest answer, Councillor Pearce, is that's not my area of expertise, but there are people in the council who do deal with building control and fire safety, and I am aware of that gymnasium in Willow Lane. So I suggest that maybe tomorrow outside the meeting, we might exchange some details on that.
Obviously, since the pandemic, it's not, my daughter hasn't taken my granddaughter there. And of course, we're going to come out of that pandemic in a month or two. And of course, I can't say things can get back to normal, but things are going to get busier and busier. And I don't know, it occurred to me then, I never took any notice of it for 35 years, but now, of course, as a concerned grandfather, I do.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
For that. Thank you, Councillor Pearce. Councillor Stanford, would you like to come in at this stage?
Okay, so thank you, Carl. Thank you, Tara. I've got a few little issues I want to talk about. First of all, I'm really pleased that a lot of people seem to be waking up to the fact that we have got a climate change crisis going on, and I'm glad to see it's top of the list of priority to deal with, because, you know, as you say, that is the thing that's going to be driving everything that happens in the future, for, you know, including for young people and our kids and grandchildren and all the rest of it. So I'm pleased about that. Now, going back to Willow Lane Industrial Estate, I think I kind of, with the pandemic looming up, it went out of my mind, the issue about Connect House and those poor families and kids who were squashed in there in disgusting circumstances through the prior approval planning applications. And I honestly thought that they'd been kind of sorted out with all the publicity that got. So are you telling me that they are still there, those children and families? Because I was hoping that they'd been moved into somewhere more suitable. But anyway, that's another issue. The talk about other alternative other sites, and you mentioned the Wilson and the other site over the other side of Cricket Green, which I've forgotten the name of now. You did say it, but next to that as well is Cumberland House, which we are also. I'm not quite sure if that's National Health Land or if that's Merton Land, because that's where the dementia hub currently is, which is going to be changed to an outreach service from various other venues. So, do we know, is Cumberland House going to be used for other purposes, or is it National Health ground that they've got something in mind for it? And I don't really want to talk about Watley Avenue and the situation there. We've had huge discussions about that in another meeting. But I wanted to talk about this issue about tall buildings and dense developments for housing and the repercussions that aren't always thought of when these buildings are erected, and we are taking the cost of that certainly in Figs in my ward in Mitcham, of what's happened over the years, with the problems that we're having now, particularly in the sort of east of Figs Marsh ward, where the density of housing that has increased so rapidly after through the last 30 years, really, with huge developments going in on what was open ground like Tooting Richmond Football Club, the athletics track, the sort of playground areas around the school and things like that, without any thought of the repercussions to the utilities and the services that were needed for this increased population. And the last couple of weeks, we've had Thames water problems across the area, but in that area in particular, we've had now, floods, blocked drains, raw sewerage running around people's back gardens, and real problems because it was built on an old site with aging sewers at the time, and they are just constantly, they can't take the actual capacity. And so, I really hope that when we're putting in these big, huge, dense buildings, yes, of course schools and doctor services and all those other things are important as well. But the infrastructure, the utilities, the waterworks, the gas, electricity, and all those other services need to be considered as well, because they're creaking at the knees, and we're all goodness knows what's going to happen in the future if that's not taken account of. I think that's all for now.
Thanks for that, Geraldine, Councillor Stanford. I think some of that may be a little bit out of scope.
Well, yes, it just some of it's comments, yes, but I don't know if Tara knows anything about the Cumberland site. If that is National Health or Merton's, I'm not quite sure here.
I'm afraid I'm struggling to recall the details of that myself, Councillor. I suggest I have seen something on it recently, and I will pass it to you after the meeting, because I'm afraid I can't recall the details now. It's not part of what we're proposing tonight. On your points about infrastructure, it helps that we have the infrastructure delivery plan and that we have focused on all aspects of infrastructure. So the obvious ones everyone thinks about are healthcare and school places and transport. But actually, just as important as you say, Councillor, is water supply, wastewater, green spaces, broadband connections. Believe it or not, there are parts of the borough which are broadband deserts, which seems incredible considering we live in London. And so what we've prepared is the needs assessment for infrastructure. And also, it really helps that we have a very comprehensive response from Thames Water, which looks at every single site we've proposed in the local plan and gives a view as to whether or not the infrastructure is adequate, or whether, if the site were to be developed, the site would have to contribute to improving the infrastructure. And the other point arising from their response that we're going to speak to both Thames Water and the electricity and broadband providers, UK Power Networks and the broadband providers, is that Merton is characterised by small sites. So we have the sites in the local plan, but most of our development takes place on small sites scattered across the borough of less than 10 homes. And because of that, that's simply fragmented land ownership. Because of that characteristic, we want to make sure that our infrastructure providers are able to keep pace with those very frequent small sites developments, which may be harder to plan for than one big site of 1,000 homes. So that's one of the things we'll be re-engaging with the infrastructure providers to make sure that they're not just focused on the sites that we're highlighting, but also on the incremental types of development. It's also, final point is that we're developing an online map that will allow people to see where there are issues of flood risk from surface water, so where drains are blocked, allowed to see what kind of action's being taken. So instead of having to look at a list, that you'll be able to just look at the equivalent of Google Maps and see where the investment's taking place, and see where people have said, actually, this is flooding all the time, the water, when it rains, it's just not going down the drains fast enough, so that we can be more agile about the information we're conveying, but also about the actions we're taking.
Thank you, Tara. Councillor Latif, thank you for your patience in coming in at the end.
Thank you very much, Chair, and hopefully a very, very quick question. Tara, you when we were talking about Plan Wimbledon, there's something you said, which I still remember, that if they become a forum, they can then do a neighbourhood plan, which will become a statutory document, and that statutory document is legal and people can refer to it. So my question is that could there be an instance where their neighbourhood plan goes against your local plan? And if that happens, how do we resolve those issues?
That's a good question. For a neighbourhood plan to pass its own examination, it has to be in line with the strategic policies of the area. So in other words, in London, for example, you couldn't have a neighbourhood plan that refused to allow new homes to be built in the area because London's housing needs is high, or something similar to deal with the strategic matters. On a sort of lower level, on a design for a particular street or a particular part of the neighbourhood plan area, yes, it could be the case that, I'm trying to think of a scenario, but that the council's design advice for this particular street or area says X, and the neighbourhood plan says something slightly different to X. Now, it's unlikely to be too extreme. So, for example, it's unlikely to succeed if one plan said hugely tall buildings and the other plan didn't. I just don't see that that scenario would realistically arise. But there could be scenarios where there was a slight difference in emphasis about whether, for example, a building should be fully protected or whether it should be allowed to be reimagined or something. So I think on a local level, and let's be realistic, design of buildings and places and spaces is what people really care about. There could be maybe tensions between a neighbourhood plan and a local plan. In that scenario, usually in plain terms, it's the most recently adopted document that prevails. But if there was a tension, I understand that it's the neighbourhood plan that usually prevails if there's a tension in interpretation. I don't see that. It's likely that most neighbourhood plans are a good deal more detailed than local plans because they can be, because they're focused on a much smaller area. So hopefully we'll end up with a scenario where we're generally flowing in the same direction. And we shouldn't ever end up in a scenario where there's an absolute clash between the two. I just don't see that would result in a successful neighbourhood plan.
Thank you for that, Tara. Thank you for that question. It's led to a follow-up from me, which just because this is obviously neighbourhood plans are a new thing for us, and I'm also a member of the planning committee. Could you get to a point where an application came and effectively the planning committee ends up adjudicating between the two, and it's planning committee members that do that, or is that likely to be resolved earlier on? You may not be able to answer that, but I thought I'd ask.
I think maybe not adjudicating, but it isn't. It happens now if we think about it. We have the London plan and we have the council's local plans, and people in considering applications, whether they are council officers or councillors or residents or anybody, they will focus on the parts they're trying to achieve, and they might take a sentence or a policy or a paragraph from one plan and say, actually, this is what we should prioritize. And somebody else might say, actually, no, should be more important. So weighing up the plan balance happens all the time, and it's perfectly normal. And I suggest that maybe every application it happens with. So I do suspect that in the future, part of the plan balance for an area that has a local plan, a neighbourhood plan, a London plan, a national policy will be to weigh up if there are any tensions between any of those and come to a conclusion.
That neatly leads me back to the question I was going to ask and my final question. We talked about the London plan. We talked a lot about height as well, and I appreciate the London plan has just formally been adopted this week. But I wondered if you could say something about how the extent to which the London plan complements our local plan as is, and particularly the pinnacle height in Collier's Wood and our policies around that, and how it will, as you feed that in the next stage, how it will complement and strengthen what we're proposing on heights specifically.
Yes, the London plan is being adopted this week. Councillors may be aware that the Secretary of State made a number of directions to the plan. So in other words, he told the mayor, you must change the plan if you want to adopt it. Some of these directions in late December actually were around building height. So as it happens, we had already taken a position in this draft local plan to say that anything above 6 stories in Merton is considered a taller building. And as it happens, the Secretary of State made exactly the same change to the Mayor's London plan. So as it happens, the Mayor's London plan is following what we are already doing. We do have to make some amendments to talk about an 18-metre height, because of course stories are different. If they're commercial stories, they tend to be bigger in height than residential stories. But generally, we're already in line with what the Mayor has changed and what the Secretary of State has changed. And it really is just tweaking the nuances. I should also mention that the Borough Character Study is out for consultation at the moment, as councillors are maybe aware. And that talks about where taller buildings, the design around taller buildings. It doesn't say where they are acceptable or not, but it says if somebody is going to develop a taller building, it needs to have higher quality design parameters, and these are the things you should consider.
Brilliant, thank you, Tara. Has anyone got any final questions before we wrap up? Councillor Fairclough.
Thank you, Chair. I had one last question. In fact, pretty much the last council meeting I had pre-lockdown with you, Tara, and the Apostles Residents Association about the issue that they raise or that they see on flat conversions, house to flat conversions, and we talked around some ideas of what that might look like in the London plan going forward. I wondered if you might be able to comment on how those conversations and the consultation has affected rules around that. Is there anything coming up in the local plan that will reflect that?
Yes, we're reviewing the submission from the Apostles Residents Association. For everyone's benefits, one of the views of the Apostles Residents Association is that the characteristics of those streets of the Apostles are often of slightly unusual 2-bedroom houses. And the council's current planning policies have to try and retain family homes. We have a current policy that says if you have a 3-bed house and you're going to convert it to flats, you must re-provide the 3-bed home so that in the future we can retain families in the borough. What the Apostles Residents Association cited is that because these are 2-bed houses, that actually some of them were being converted and not re-providing the family home because there were only 2 beds in the first place. And the Residents Association did a wealth of work on this and looked in detail at the streets on the Apostles. And it's fair to say that we're sort of quite a lot of empathy with what they want to achieve here, but it must be set in the context of the fact that we do welcome all sizes of homes. And we've looked at the number of homes that are converted, especially in the past 5-6 years, which is probably the more recent housing trend. And actually conversions in the Apostles area have slowed down an awful lot. It's also fair to say that both the Secretary of State and the Mayor of London are certainly keen on providing homes of all sizes and types. So what we have to do is revisit what the Apostles have asked us to do, which is kind of restrict the conversions of homes in that area, but set in the context of the need for more homes and the need for more 1-bed, 2-bed and 3-bed type of homes. So I think that's where we're at the moment, Councillor, where we're just considering those issues and the tension that kind of rise between them. But it is worth pointing out that the conversion rates have slowed down an awful lot in that area, probably because of the desirability of the 2-bedroom houses as they are.
You're muted, Carl.
The host has put up a reminder for me as well. I've got a little box to tell me. So I think that looks like it's it for questions. So if we move, can I move for us to accept the report? Everyone's nodding. I think that's a yay from us. I'd just like to finally thank you all, and thank Tara and Amy as well for being with us tonight, and Tara for talking us through and answering all our questions. So I think it's a good night to you all, and